They didn't even look me in the eye when they sat me there. I folded my napkin and left that night. But what I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of discovering how invisible I'd become in my own family. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep finding the courage to tell these stories that need to be heard. The burgundy cardigan hung loose on my 72-year-old frame as I stood before my bedroom mirror that Tuesday evening, my arthritic fingers working slowly to fasten each pearl button. I'd chosen it carefully, the color still vibrant enough to suggest I hadn't completely given up on myself, yet modest enough not to draw unwanted attention to how much weight I'd lost since Harold passed 3 years ago. The fabric, though worn soft from countless washings, still held its shape well enough to make me feel presentable for my son David's 45th birthday dinner. My hands trembled slightly as I applied a thin layer of coral lipstick, the same shade I'd worn for 30 years because Harold had once said it made my smile look like sunshine. The bathroom light was harsh and unforgiving, revealing every liver spot and wrinkle that had deepened since I'd stopped being able to afford my monthly visits to Elena's beauty salon. But I pressed powder over my cheeks anyway, hoping to bring some life back to the pale complexion that seemed to grow more translucent with each passing month. The small wrapped gift sat on my dresser, a silk scarf in soft blues and greens that I'd found at Marshall's, marked down twice but still beautiful enough to make me think Victoria might actually like it. I'd saved for 2 months to buy it, setting aside $5 here and there from my Social Security check, skipping lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays to make the numbers work. The wrapping paper was leftover from last Christmas, carefully smoothed and reused, but the bow was new, a small indulgence that made the gift feel special despite my limited budget. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror, and for a moment, I saw myself as I used to be, the young mother who had raised David alone after Harold's heart attack, working double shifts at the diner while taking night classes to become a certified nursing assistant. I saw the woman who had cheered at every Little League game, who had sewn David's Halloween costumes by hand, who had somehow managed to save enough money to help with his college tuition, even though it meant eating beans and rice for dinner most nights. But that woman felt like a stranger now. In her place stood someone smaller, quieter, more apologetic. Someone who had learned to take up less space in a world that seemed increasingly unwilling to make room for aging women with limited means and unlimited love to give. The drive to Marcello's Italian restaurant took me through neighborhoods I remembered from David's childhood, past the elementary school where I'd volunteered in the library every Friday, past the park where we'd spent countless Saturday afternoons flying the red kite I'd bought him for his 8th birthday. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and apple cider, and for a moment, my heart lifted with the anticipation of seeing my grandson Tommy, now 15, and growing so tall I barely recognized the little boy who used to climb into my lap, demanding stories about dragons and brave knights. Marcello's had been David's favorite restaurant since high school, the kind of family-owned establishment with checkered tablecloths and the warm aroma of garlic bread that made every meal feel like a celebration. I'd brought him here for his graduation dinner, his 21st birthday, the night before his wedding to Victoria. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, greeted me warmly and said the Morrison party was already seated. But as she led me through the dining room, my stomach began to sink. The family was gathered around a large round table near the window, David in his navy suit looking prosperous and confident, Victoria elegant in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, Tommy absorbed in his phone, and Victoria's parents, Richard and Helen, who had never quite warmed to me despite 15 years of polite attempts at conversation. And there, positioned several feet away from the main table, sat a single folding chair. Not one of the restaurant's upholstered dining chairs, but a metal folding chair like the ones they brought out for overflow seating during wedding receptions. It was placed in the corner by the service station, close enough to technically be part of the group, but far enough away that I might as well have been dining alone. A small side table had been set with a single place setting, the kind of afterthought arrangement that made it clear I was an unwelcome obligation rather than a cherished family member. "We thought you'd be more comfortable over here," Victoria said without standing, her smile as thin and sharp as the edge of a credit card. "Last time you spilled your soup, remember?" This way you don't have to worry about accidents. It's better for everyone. The words hit me like ice water. Last month, at Tommy's birthday dinner, my hand had shaken slightly while eating the minestrone, a side effect of the new blood pressure medication I could barely afford, and a few drops had landed on the white tablecloth. Victoria had immediately called the server over to clean it up, making a show of apologizing for Grandma's little mishap, while looking at me with the same expression someone might reserve for a misbehaving toddler. "Hi, Mom," David said, finally glancing in my direction but not standing to greet me. "You look nice. How was the drive over?" Tommy didn't look up from his phone. Victoria's parents nodded politely, but immediately returned to their conversation about their recent cruise to Alaska. I stood there for a moment, holding my small gift, feeling as though I was interrupting rather than joining my own son's birthday celebration. The server approached with menus for everyone at the main table, then paused when he noticed me. "Oh, and for the lady," he looked uncertain, as if unsure whether I was actually part of the group or simply someone who happened to be standing nearby. "She'll have the grilled chicken breast," Victoria announced before I could speak. "No spices, please. She has trouble with seasoning, and make sure it's well done. She has difficulty chewing. Oh, and water, not wine. She's on medication." I opened my mouth to correct her. I had no trouble chewing. I enjoyed moderately spiced food, and one glass of wine with dinner had never interfered with my blood pressure pills. But something in Victoria's tone suggested that contradicting her would be unwelcome. So I nodded and took my seat in the corner, placing the wrapped gift on my small table where it looked lonely and out of place. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed David's recent promotion, Tommy's acceptance into the advanced placement program at school, vacation plans for spring break. Occasionally, someone would glance in my direction and smile, the kind of automatic courtesy extended to peripheral family members at obligatory gatherings. But no one asked about my week, my health, my garden, or anything else that might suggest genuine interest in my life. When the food arrived, my chicken was indeed overcooked and bland, while the rest of the family enjoyed pasta dishes that looked vibrant and aromatic. I ate slowly, making each bite last, knowing that this institutional-style meal was likely to be the best food I'd have all week. At home, dinner usually consisted of canned soup or a peanut butter sandwich, supplemented by whatever marked-down produce I could find at the discount grocery store. "So, Mom," David said during a lull in conversation, "how are you managing? Everything okay with the house?" The question should have opened the door for honest conversation. About the leaking roof I couldn't afford to repair, the heating bills that forced me to choose between warmth and groceries, the loneliness that sometimes felt so overwhelming, I found myself talking to Harold's photograph just to hear a voice in the silence. But something in David's tone suggested he was asking out of obligation rather than genuine concern, and I knew that any real answer would make everyone uncomfortable. "Everything's fine," I said, the words feeling like sand in my mouth. "The house is fine." Victoria's laugh was bright and artificial. "Oh, that's good to hear. We were worried you might be struggling. David was saying just the other day that we should probably think about assisted living options. You know, somewhere with activities and people your own age. Wouldn't that be nice?" The suggestion landed like a physical blow. Assisted living, the euphemism for warehousing inconvenient elderly relatives in sterile facilities where they could be visited occasionally without disrupting anyone's actual life. I thought of my little house with Harold's workshop still intact in the garage, his tools hanging exactly where he'd left them. I thought of the garden where I'd planted perennials that bloomed every spring, marking the passage of time and seasons in ways that gave my days structure and meaning. "I'm not ready for that," I said quietly. "Of course not." Victoria's voice had taken on the patronizing tone people use with children. "But it's never too early to plan ahead. And honestly, the maintenance on that old house must be overwhelming. Wouldn't it be easier to let someone else worry about all that?" Tommy finally looked up from his phone, but only to ask his father if he could leave early to meet friends at the mall. David immediately agreed, pulling out his wallet to give his son money for whatever teenage activities awaited him. No one suggested that Tommy might want to spend a few minutes talking to his grandmother, might be interested in the stories I could tell about David's own teenage years. might benefit from learning about family history that connected him to something larger than his immediate wants and needs. As coffee was served to the main table, none offered to me, I found myself staring at the folding chair beneath me, feeling its instability, its temporary nature, its clear message that I was here on sufferance rather than by right. This chair represented everything I had become in my family's eyes: expendable, easily moved, requiring minimal accommodation, fundamentally different from the real furniture designed for people who mattered. The gift remained unwrapped on my table. No one had asked about it, and the moment for presenting it had passed without acknowledgement. I would take it home and add it to the small collection of unopened presents I'd bought for family members over the years, tokens of love that had been deemed unnecessary or inappropriate for actual giving. When the check came, David paid without consulting anyone about individual contributions. I reached for my purse, prepared to offer what I could toward the meal. But Victoria waved me away with a gesture that managed to be both generous and dismissive. "Don't worry about it," she said. "We've got this." But I did worry. I worried that my inability to contribute financially had somehow diminished my value as a family member. I worried that my presence had become a burden rather than a joy. I worried that the woman who had once been the center of David's world had been relegated to a folding chair in the corner, visible enough to satisfy obligations, but removed enough to avoid inconvenience. As we prepared to leave, Victoria gathered her purse and coat with the efficient movements of someone eager to conclude an unpleasant duty. "This was lovely," she said to the table in general, though her eyes never quite met mine. "We should do this more often." But even as she spoke the words, I knew they were empty. We would not do this more often. This dinner had been sufficient to check the box marked "Include elderly mother-in-law in birthday celebration," and that box wouldn't need checking again for quite some time. I folded my napkin carefully, the linen soft between my fingers, and placed it beside my empty water glass. I smoothed my skirt, gathered my purse and the unwrapped gift, and stood up slowly, my arthritis making the movement more deliberate than I intended. No one noticed. No one offered assistance. No one asked if I needed help to my car. I walked across the restaurant's warm, softly lit dining room, past tables where other families laughed and celebrated together, past couples sharing dessert and wine, past the hostess who smiled and wished me a good evening. I pushed through the heavy glass door into the cool October night, where my breath made small clouds in the air, and the distant sound of traffic reminded me that the world continued its relentless motion, regardless of private heartbreak. The drive home took me back through those same familiar neighborhoods, but now they looked different in the darkness. The elementary school was empty and locked, its playground equipment casting strange shadows under the streetlights. The park where David and I had flown kites was deserted except for a lone jogger with reflective gear and earbuds, running through a world of private music and personal goals. At home, I hung my burgundy cardigan in the closet and placed the unwrapped gift on the shelf with the others. I washed my face, removing the coral lipstick and powder that had failed to make me feel presentable enough to warrant a real chair at my son's birthday dinner. In my nightgown, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the photograph on my nightstand. Harold and David at a Cubs game when David was 12, both of them grinning at the camera with matching baseball caps and mustard stains on their shirts from the hot dogs I'd bought them with money I couldn't really spare. That night, as I lay in the darkness listening to the house settle around me, I understood with devastating clarity that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with the family I'd built and nurtured and sacrificed for. I was no longer a central character in their story. I had become a supporting player, a bit part, an obligation to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. The folding chair had been more than seating arrangement. It had been a statement, a boundary, a clear message about my place in the hierarchy of family importance. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of discovering just how invisible I had become to the people I loved most. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, staring at Harold's empty chair across from me, and for the first time in years, I let myself remember everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had been to this family before I became nothing more than a problem to be managed. The manila folder sat in my lap, thick with receipts and bank statements I'd kept meticulously over the years. Evidence of a generosity that had gone unnoticed, unacknowledged, and apparently completely forgotten. I'd pulled it from the bottom drawer of Harold's old desk that morning, needing to see the numbers, needing to prove to myself that my memory wasn't playing tricks on me, that I really had been the person I thought I was. The first receipt was dated 15 years ago, $12,000. David's wedding expenses. Harold and I had emptied our savings account to help pay for the reception at the Riverside Country Club, because Victoria's parents had insisted on the kind of wedding our daughter deserves, but somehow couldn't cover the full costs themselves. I remembered Harold arguing with me about it late one night in this very kitchen, his voice strained with worry. "Dorothy, that's every penny we've saved for our retirement," he'd said, running his hands through his graying hair. "What if something happens? What if one of us gets sick?" But David had looked so hopeful when he'd asked, so sure that this gesture would mean the world to Victoria, would start their marriage off on the right foot. "It's just a loan, Mom," he'd promised. "I'll pay you back as soon as I get established in my career. 2 years, tops." 15 years later, that loan had never been mentioned again. I flipped through more receipts, each one a small cut that had bled my bank account slowly but steadily. Tommy's private school tuition when David was between jobs, $8,500. The down payment on their first house when the bank required additional funds, $15,000 from Harold's pension. Victoria's car payment when her credit was temporarily compromised. 6 months of $400 payments that stretched into 2 years of my grocery money. Then came the emergency loans. Victoria's mother's medical bills when her insurance wouldn't cover the full treatment, $6,000. The family vacation to Disney World because Tommy deserves to have memories like other kids, $3,200. The new kitchen appliances when their old ones embarrassingly outdated for Victoria's book club meetings, $2,800. Every time they'd approached me with such careful gratitude, such elaborate explanations about temporary setbacks and upcoming bonuses and certain repayments. Victoria would hug me and call me the most generous mother-in-law in the world. David would promise to take me out for a nice dinner as soon as things settled down. Tommy would kiss my cheek and tell me I was the best grandma ever. But the repayments never came, and eventually, even the promises stopped. I found the hospital receipts from Harold's final illness, when the cancer had spread too far and too fast for the doctors to offer anything but comfort care. David had visited twice during those 6 months, once when the diagnosis was first made, and once for the funeral. Both times he'd spent most of his visit on his phone, taking work calls that apparently couldn't wait even for death and grief. Victoria had sent flowers to the funeral. Beautiful, expensive arrangements that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, but she hadn't come herself. "Travel is so difficult with Tommy's schedule," the card had read. "Thinking of you during this difficult time." Tommy, who was 12 then, hadn't come either. Too young for funerals, they'd decided. Too traumatic for a child to see his grandfather in a casket. Never mind that Harold had specifically asked to see his grandson one last time, had held on for an extra week hoping the boy might visit. After Harold's funeral, when the house felt impossibly empty and the silence stretched through days that had no structure or purpose, I'd waited for David to call, to check on me, to ask how I was managing alone for the first time in 43 years of marriage, to offer some gesture of support during the worst period of my life. The call never came. Instead, 2 weeks later, Victoria had phoned with a bright, cheerful voice to ask if I could help with Tommy's braces. "The orthodontist says it's really urgent," she'd explained. "His bite is getting worse every day we wait. And you know how kids can be about their appearance. We just want him to feel confident." I'd written the check, $4,500, because what else was a grandmother supposed to do? Let her grandson suffer social embarrassment because adults couldn't manage their finances? But I'd hung up the phone with a hollow feeling in my chest, understanding for the first time that I had become nothing more than a source of emergency funding, a financial safety net that could be activated when convenient and ignored when not needed. The pattern had continued through the years with relentless consistency. Car repairs, home improvements, medical bills, vacation funds, always presented as emergencies, always accompanied by promises of repayment, always forgotten once the crisis had passed and my check had cleared. I thought about the Christmas mornings when I'd arrived at their house with arms full of carefully chosen gifts, only to find that my own present was clearly an afterthought. Drugstore perfume still in the shopping bag, generic chocolates picked up at the last minute, gift cards in odd amounts that suggested leftover balances from other purchases. I remembered Tommy's birthday parties where I was assigned to bring paper plates and napkins while other relatives brought the exciting gifts and fun activities. I was the reliable one, the practical one, the one who could be counted on to handle the boring necessities while others got to be the stars of the celebration. I thought about the family photos where I was consistently positioned at the edge of the group, easy to crop out if the composition needed adjustment. About the holiday meals where I was asked to bring side dishes but never consulted about the menu. About the family vacations I was never invited to join, though I often helped fund them through my generous contributions to the family budget. The realization that had been building for months crystallized with painful clarity. I had spent 15 years buying love that was never for sale. I had confused financial usefulness with family importance, had believed that my willingness to sacrifice would eventually earn me the kind of cherished place in the family that couldn't be purchased, but had to be freely given. Instead, my generosity had made me invisible. Every check I'd written had somehow diminished rather than enhanced my value in their eyes. I had become the family ATM, reliable, accessible when needed, but not particularly interesting or important beyond its function. I pulled out my current bank statement, the one that showed the reality of my financial situation after years of putting my family's wants ahead of my own needs. The checking account balance was $247.83. My savings account, once substantial enough to provide security and peace of mind, now held $2,100, barely enough for a single month's expenses if everything went perfectly and no unexpected costs arose. But everything never went perfectly when you were 72 years old and living on Social Security. The water heater could fail, the car could break down, a medical emergency could wipe out those meager reserves in a single afternoon. And who would I call for help? The son I'd supported through every crisis of his adult life, who hadn't noticed I was struggling. The daughter-in-law who seated me at folding chairs and ordered my meals without asking what I wanted. I thought about Harold's workshop in the garage, still exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago because I couldn't bear to disturb the careful arrangement of his tools and projects. But maybe it was time. Maybe I needed to sell his equipment, his woodworking bench, the vintage tools he'd collected over decades of weekend projects and careful craftsmanship. The money would help, and the empty space might hurt less than the shrine to a marriage that David seemed to have forgotten even as he benefited from its legacy. The afternoon sun slanted through my kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air and highlighting the worn spots on the linoleum floor that Harold had always promised to replace. "Next month," he'd say, "when things slow down at work." But next month had never come, and now the floor would remain worn because I couldn't afford professional installation and lacked the strength to do the work myself. I made myself a bologna sandwich for lunch, the cheap lunch meat from the discount grocery store, spread thinly on day-old bread, and tried to remember the last time someone in my family had asked me about my day, my health, my dreams, my fears. Tried to remember the last time David had called just to talk, without needing money or favors or emergency babysitting. The silence stretched through the afternoon like a physical weight. No phone calls, no visitors. No one wondering how Harold's widow was managing in the house that had once been filled with laughter and conversation, and the comfortable sounds of a life shared with someone who truly saw me. By evening, as I sat in Harold's chair watching the local news, I found myself wondering, was I used? Had I been nothing more than a convenient source of financial support? An aging woman so desperate for family connection that I'd confused being needed with being loved? Had my willingness to sacrifice made me worthless in their eyes? Someone whose needs could be safely ignored because she'd proven over and over that she would always give more than she received? The question burned in my chest, like heartburn, persistent and painful, and impossible to ignore. For the first time in my life, I was forced to consider the possibility that the family I'd devoted myself to serving might see me as nothing more than a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be cherished. And as the darkness gathered outside my windows, and the house settled into its nightly creaks and sighs, I understood that tomorrow would bring the same silence, the same invisibility, the same slow erosion of dignity that came from being necessary only when convenient and forgotten as soon as the crisis passed. The manila folder sat on the table beside my empty dinner plate, its contents telling the story of a woman who had given everything and somehow received less than nothing in return. But more than the money, more than the accumulated debt of ungrateful family members, what hurt most was the growing certainty that I had been systematically trained to expect so little that a folding chair in a corner felt like inclusion rather than exile. Was I used? The question echoed through the empty rooms of my house, demanding an answer I wasn't sure I was ready to face. 3 weeks passed after David's birthday dinner, and the silence from my family felt different this time. Heavier, more deliberate. No thank you call for attending. No mention of the gift I'd brought but never given. It was as if I'd simply disappeared from their lives the moment I walked out of that restaurant, and no one had noticed enough to wonder why. I found myself marking time by small humiliations that accumulated like paper cuts. The grocery store clerk who spoke louder and slower when I took too long counting change. The pharmacist who suggested I might want to consider the generic version of my blood pressure medication, as if my financial limitations were written across my forehead. The neighbor who waved politely but never stopped to chat the way she used to when Harold was alive and I was half of a couple rather than a solitary reminder of aging and loss. But it was Tommy's 15th birthday that finally shattered what remained of my illusions about my place in this family. I'd spent 2 weeks planning what I could afford to give him. The electronics and expensive clothes he wanted were far beyond my means. But I'd found a vintage baseball card at an estate sale, a 1954 rookie card in excellent condition that the seller hadn't realized was worth more than the $50 I'd paid for it. Tommy had been interested in baseball cards when he was younger, had spent hours organizing his collection by teams and years. I'd hoped this might rekindle that interest, might give us something to share again. The party was held at David and Victoria's house on a Saturday afternoon. I arrived precisely on time, as I always did, carrying my carefully wrapped gift and a store-bought cake because Victoria had specifically asked me to handle the dessert, while she focused on the important details of the celebration. But when I walked into their backyard, I stopped so suddenly that Mrs. Patterson from next door nearly collided with me. There, stretched across the deck railing, was a banner I'd never seen before. Happy 15th birthday, Tommy. Love from your Grandma Rosie and Grandpa Jim. Grandma Rosie and Grandpa Jim, Victoria's parents. The same Richard and Helen who had barely acknowledged my existence at David's birthday dinner 3 weeks earlier. I stood there holding my cake, watching as Victoria's mother directed the placement of an elaborate gift table laden with expensive-looking packages, while Victoria's father set up a professional-grade barbecue grill that definitely hadn't been there during my last visit. They moved through the space with the confidence of people who belonged, who were central to the celebration, who were expected and welcomed rather than tolerated. "Oh, Dorothy!" Victoria appeared at my elbow with that bright, artificial smile that always made me feel like an unwelcome door-to-door salesperson. "You made it. Just set the cake on the kitchen counter, would you? We already have plenty of dessert, but I'm sure we can find room for yours somewhere." She gestured toward the elaborate dessert station her mother had arranged, a 3-tier chocolate cake from the expensive bakery downtown, an ice cream bar with premium flavors, fresh fruit arrangements that looked like professional catering, my simple sheet cake from the grocery store, with its generic happy birthday message in blue frosting, suddenly looked pathetic and inadequate. "Where should I put Tommy's gift?" I asked, looking toward the overflowing gift table. Victoria glanced at the small wrapped package in my hands, then at the collection of large, professionally wrapped presents that dominated the display. "Oh, anywhere is fine. Maybe on that side table? We're trying to keep the main gift area organized for the big presents." The side table. Again, just like the folding chair at the restaurant, I was being relegated to the periphery, positioned where my presence wouldn't interfere with the real celebration happening around me. I watched as Tommy opened his gifts, his face lighting up with genuine excitement as he unwrapped the latest gaming console from Grandma Rosie and Grandpa Jim, designer clothes from other relatives, expensive sports equipment from family friends I'd never met. When he finally reached my carefully chosen baseball card, he held it up with polite confusion. "It's a vintage card," I explained, my voice sounding thin and desperate in the outdoor air. "From 1954. I thought you might like it for your collection." Tommy smiled the kind of smile teenagers reserve for gifts from elderly relatives who don't understand their current interests. "Thanks, Grandma Dorothy. That's really nice." But he set it aside immediately, reaching for the next exciting package while the card lay forgotten among the discarded wrapping paper. I felt the sting of being called Grandma Dorothy rather than just Grandma, a formal title that created distance rather than intimacy, that grouped me with other peripheral relatives rather than acknowledging any special bond. Victoria's parents, meanwhile, basked in Tommy's enthusiasm for their expensive gifts. Grandma Rosie hugged him tightly while he thanked her for the gaming console. Grandpa Jim showed him features on the new equipment, while Tommy listened with rapt attention. They were the stars of his birthday, the grandparents who mattered, who understood what 15-year-old boys wanted and had the means to provide it. I found myself standing alone by the side table, invisible among the celebrations swirling around me. No one asked me to join the family photos being taken with the birthday boy. No one included me in conversations about Tommy's upcoming school year, or his interests, or his achievements. I was present, but not participating, visible, but not seen. The breaking point came when I overheard Victoria talking to one of her friends near the kitchen window. "We're so grateful David's mother could make it," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone discussing a charitable obligation. "She's been having such a hard time since Harold passed. We try to include her when we can, you know. It's important for Tommy to understand responsibility toward elderly family members." Responsibility. Not love, not affection, not genuine desire for my company. Responsibility. I was a duty to be discharged, a burden to be managed, an aging relative who needed to be included occasionally to maintain the appearance of proper family values. "That's so sweet of you," her friend replied. "It must be difficult dealing with all that. Does she need, assistance?" "Oh, she's fine," Victoria said with a dismissive wave. "Very independent, very proud. You know how that generation can be about accepting help. But we keep an eye on her. Keep an eye on her. As if I were a potentially dangerous animal that required monitoring. As if my independence were a character flaw rather than a necessity born of being systematically excluded from meaningful family connection." I slipped away from the party without saying goodbye, leaving my untouched slice of store-bought cake on the counter and walking to my car with the careful dignity of someone who refuses to let others see how completely they've been broken. No one followed me. No one called out to ask where I was going. My departure was as unnoticed as my presence had been unwelcome. That night, I sat in Harold's chair and did something I hadn't done since his funeral. I cried until my chest ached and my eyes swelled shut. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone grieving a loss, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone discovering that the love they'd believed in had never actually existed. I was 67 years old, and I had just learned that I was not a beloved grandmother, but a tolerated obligation, not a cherished family member, but a responsibility to be managed. Not someone whose presence brought joy, but someone whose absence wouldn't even be noticed. The next morning brought a discovery that shattered what remained of my heart. I'd been looking for my insurance papers in Harold's old desk when I found the letter, tucked between some old tax returns. It was addressed to David, dated 6 months after Harold's funeral, written in Victoria's precise handwriting. The letter was a complaint to David about my increasing neediness and inappropriate expectations regarding my role in their family. She wrote about feeling suffocated by my desire to spend time with Tommy, about being frustrated by my financial requests, the same requests they had initiated, the emergency loans they had begged for and promised to repay. But the paragraph that destroyed me read, "I think we need to establish clearer boundaries with your mother. She seems to think that because she helped us financially in the past, she has some kind of claim on our time and attention. We need to make it clear that those were gifts, not investments in a relationship. Tommy barely knows her, and frankly, he's old enough now that forcing a relationship with her feels artificial and uncomfortable for everyone involved. Gifts, not investments in a relationship. My 15 years of sacrifice, my emptied savings accounts, my willingness to go without so they could have more. All of it dismissed as simple charity, with no expectation of gratitude or connection. And Tommy barely knew me because they had systematically excluded me from his life, had treated my presence as an intrusion rather than a blessing. The letter continued with suggestions for managing me, limiting visits to major holidays, setting clear time boundaries for phone calls, redirecting my emotional energy toward more appropriate outlets like senior center activities or volunteer work with people her own age. I was a problem to be solved, a burden to be minimized, an inconvenient remnant of David's past that needed to be carefully managed to avoid disrupting their present happiness. The woman who had raised David alone, who had sacrificed her retirement security for their wedding, who had been their financial safety net through every crisis. That woman had been reduced to a nuisance whose love was unwelcome and whose presence was tolerated only out of social obligation. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back where I'd found it, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Then I walked to my kitchen, made myself a cup of tea with hands that had somehow stopped shaking, and sat down to think clearly for the first time in months. For 67 years, I had defined myself through other people's needs. I had been Harold's devoted wife, David's sacrificing mother, Tommy's doting grandmother. I had measured my worth by how much I could give, how many problems I could solve, how many sacrifices I could make without complaint. But sitting in my quiet kitchen with Victoria's letter fresh in my memory, I finally understood that my generosity had been mistaken for weakness, my love had been confused with obligation, and my presence had become a burden rather than a gift. The question that had haunted me for weeks, was I used, suddenly had a clear and devastating answer. Yes, I had been used completely, systematically, and without remorse by people who saw my love as a resource to be exploited rather than a treasure to be cherished. But more importantly, I realized that I had allowed it to happen. I had trained them to treat me as dispensable by never demanding better, never setting boundaries, never insisting on the basic respect that every human being deserved regardless of their financial usefulness or social convenience. As the afternoon sun slanted through my kitchen window, illuminating the empty chair where Harold used to sit, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop being useful. I was going to stop being convenient. I was going to stop accepting treatment that I would never dream of giving to another person. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to put myself first, and I had no idea what that would cost me, or what it might finally give me in return. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after I'd found Victoria's letter. David's voice had that particular tone he used when he needed something, slightly rushed, carefully casual, as if the favor he was about to ask was just an afterthought rather than the entire reason for his call. "Hey, Mom, how are you doing?" he began. And for a moment, my heart lifted with the foolish hope that he might actually want to know the answer. But he barely paused before continuing. "Listen, I hate to ask, but we've got a situation here. Tommy needs his wisdom teeth out, and our dental insurance is being weird about covering the full amount. The oral surgeon wants $3,500 up front, and with Victoria's car payment and the mortgage, we're just a little tight this month. $3,500. Nearly 3 months of my Social Security income. Money I didn't have, for a family that had spent 15 years taking everything I could give, and then complained to each other about my inappropriate expectations of gratitude or inclusion. I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "I can't help with that." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a confusion so genuine it might have been funny under different circumstances. "I'm sorry, what? You can't help? Is something wrong with your account?" "Nothing's wrong with my account," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I just can't afford to lend money right now. But Mom, it's for Tommy's health. The dentist says if we don't do this soon, he could develop complications. And $3,500 really isn't that much when you think about it in terms of Tommy's future comfort and—" "David," I interrupted him, something I'd never done in 45 years of being his mother. I said no. Another long silence. Then, I don't understand what's happening here. You've always been willing to help when we needed it. Has someone been telling you not to help your family? Are you angry about something? The questions revealed so much about how my son saw me, as someone whose decisions were made by outside influences rather than personal judgment, someone whose primary function was providing financial assistance, someone whose sudden inability to fulfill that function must be the result of confusion or manipulation rather than choice. I'm not angry, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I realized they weren't entirely true. I was angry, furious actually, but it was the cold, clear anger of someone who had finally seen the truth rather than the hot, emotional anger of a momentary upset. I'm just unable to help financially right now. But this is Tommy we're talking about, David pressed, his voice taking on the persuasive tone I remembered from his teenage years when he wanted to extend his curfew or borrow the car. Your grandson? Don't you want him to avoid unnecessary pain and dental problems? The manipulation was so naked, so obvious, that I almost laughed. Of course I wanted Tommy to avoid pain. I'd wanted him to avoid the pain of having a grandmother who was treated like a stranger at his birthday party. I'd wanted him to avoid the pain of growing up in a family where love was conditional on financial usefulness. But somehow, David had never been concerned about those types of pain. I want Tommy to be healthy and happy, I said carefully, but you'll need to find another way to handle this expense. Mom, I really don't understand what's going on here. This isn't like you. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should talk to your doctor about... I hung up the phone. I hung up on my son for the first time in his life, and the silence that followed felt like stepping out of a noisy room into peaceful wilderness. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or regret. They were shaking from the adrenaline of having finally said no, of having finally drawn a boundary, of having finally treated my own financial security as important enough to protect. The phone rang again within minutes. Then again. Then again. I let it ring. When the answering machine finally picked up, Victoria's voice filled my kitchen with a tone I'd never heard her use before. Sharp, demanding, stripped of the false sweetness she usually employed when speaking to me. Dorothy, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is completely unacceptable. Tommy is in pain, and you're choosing to let your grandson suffer over money? Money that you've always been happy to share before? David is beside himself, wondering what he did wrong, and frankly, so am I. This is not the woman who raised him. This is not the grandmother Tommy deserves. Call us back immediately so we can discuss this like adults. I played the message 3 times, listening to the barely controlled rage in her voice, the sense of entitlement that assumed my money was somehow their right, rather than my choice to give. The message revealed everything I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. That my value to this family began and ended with my willingness to solve their financial problems, and that any deviation from that role was seen as a personal betrayal rather than a reasonable boundary. The next message came from David, his voice strained with what sounded like genuine distress. Mom, Victoria told me about her message, and I want to apologize for her tone. She's just worried about Tommy, you know? We both are. Look, if this is about money, we can work something out. Maybe a payment plan. You could lend us half now and half next month, or we could give you something as collateral. Victoria has some jewelry that's worth quite a bit. We just need to get Tommy's procedure scheduled before the pain gets worse. Please call me back. I love you. I love you. 3 words he'd tacked onto the end of a financial negotiation, as if love were a bargaining chip rather than an emotion, as if saying it would somehow make his request more compelling, or my refusal more cruel. For 45 years, I'd believed that David loved me. But listening to his message, I realized that what he called love might simply be appreciation for my usefulness, affection for my reliability, gratitude for my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for his convenience. Real love wouldn't have allowed him to spend 15 years taking my money without offering repayment. Real love wouldn't have positioned me at folding chairs and side tables. Real love wouldn't have reduced my role in his life to emergency ATM. That evening, as I sat in Harold's chair watching the local news, I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window, I saw David walking toward my front door with the determined stride of someone who intended to resolve a problem through sheer persistence. Victoria stayed in the car, her silhouette rigid with disapproval behind the windshield. The doorbell rang 3 times before David began knocking, then calling through the door. "Mom, I know you're in there. Your car's in the driveway and the TV's on. We need to talk about this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Just open the door." I sat perfectly still in Harold's chair, my hands folded in my lap, listening to my son plead with me to open a door I'd always kept unlocked for him. For the first time in his adult life, I was unavailable to solve his problems, unreachable for emergency assistance, unwilling to drop everything to accommodate his needs. "Mom, please. I don't understand what I did wrong. If this is about the birthday party, if you felt left out somehow, I'm sorry. Victoria's parents were visiting, and we thought you'd enjoy meeting them. If we did something to hurt your feelings, just tell me what it was and I'll fix it." If we did something to hurt your feelings. As if 15 years of systematic exclusion and financial exploitation could be reduced to hurt feelings. As if my sudden boundary setting was an emotional overreaction rather than a rational response to being treated as less than human. The knocking continued for another 10 minutes before I heard him return to the car. Through the window, I watched them sit in my driveway for nearly an hour, David occasionally gesturing as he spoke on his phone, Victoria checking her watch with increasing irritation. They were strategizing, planning their next approach, trying to understand how to manage this unprecedented situation where the reliable family ATM had suddenly malfunctioned. Finally, they drove away, leaving me alone with a silence that felt different from the lonely silence I'd grown accustomed to. This silence held power. This silence was my choice rather than their indifference. The next morning brought a knock at my door from Tommy himself. When I opened it, I was shocked by how much he'd grown in the few weeks since his birthday. Taller, broader, more adult-looking than the child I still pictured in my mind. His face was slightly swollen on one side, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Hi, Grandma Dorothy," he said, his voice carrying none of the manipulation I'd heard from his parents. "My mom said you might be able to help with my dental thing. My teeth really hurt, and the dentist says I need surgery pretty soon." Here was my grandson, 15 years old and in pain, asking for help with the same directness he'd used as a small child. For a moment, my resolve wavered. This was Tommy, not David or Victoria. Tommy, who had been shaped by their attitudes and assumptions, but might not yet be irredeemably damaged by their values. "I'm sorry you're in pain," I said, and I genuinely meant it. "But I can't help with the money." His face fell, but not with the entitled anger I'd heard from his parents. He looked confused, disappointed, but not outraged. "Oh, okay. I thought maybe, but that's okay. I guess they'll figure something out." "Tommy," I said before he could turn away, "when was the last time you came to visit me just to visit? Not because your parents sent you, not because you needed something, but just because you wanted to spend time with me?" He looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if I'd asked him to solve a complex mathematical equation. "I don't know," he said finally. "I guess, maybe when I was little, but I'm busy with school and friends and stuff now." "I understand," I said, and I did. Tommy had been raised to see me as a resource rather than a relationship, a source of emergency funds rather than a person worth knowing. That wasn't his fault, but it was his reality, and mine. After he left, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table with Harold's old photo album. Picture after picture showed the 3 of us, Harold, David, and me, during David's childhood. Camping trips, Christmas mornings, school events, summer barbecues. In every photo, we looked like a family that genuinely enjoyed each other's company. People who found joy in shared experiences, rather than obligation in enforced togetherness. But somewhere along the way, that genuine connection had been replaced by transaction. Love had been reduced to usefulness. Family had become a financial arrangement disguised as emotional bond. I closed the album and made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Tomorrow, I would go to the bank and open a new savings account in my name only. I would transfer what remained of my available funds into an account that couldn't be accessed by emergency phone calls or guilt-laden visits. I would begin building a financial safety net for my own future, rather than continuing to serve as one for people who saw my sacrifice as their right. For the first time in 15 years, I was going to choose myself. The phone rang as I was getting ready for bed, but I didn't answer it. The answering machine picked up, and David's voice filled the darkness with one final attempt at manipulation. "Mom, the dental office says they can't hold Tommy's appointment much longer. Other kids are waiting for surgery slots, and if we can't come up with the money by Friday, we'll have to reschedule for next month. That means Tommy will be in pain for weeks longer than necessary. I know you don't want that for your grandson. Whatever I did to upset you, whatever's wrong between us, please don't let Tommy suffer for it. He's just a kid, and he needs his grandmother right now." But as I listened to David's words, I realized he was wrong about one crucial thing. Tommy didn't need his grandmother right now. He needed his grandmother's money. And after 15 years of confusing the two, I was finally learning to see the difference. I turned off the answering machine and went to bed, sleeping more peacefully than I had in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation, new tests of my resolve. But tonight, for the first time in decades, I belonged completely to myself. The morning after I'd refused to answer David's final desperate voicemail, I woke up to something I hadn't experienced in 15 years. A day with no obligations to anyone but myself, no phone calls to return about family emergencies, no guilt weighing on my chest about disappointing people who only contacted me when they needed money. No mental calculations about how much I could afford to give without completely destroying my own financial security. For the first time since Harold's death, perhaps for the first time in my adult life, my day belonged entirely to me. I made coffee in Harold's favorite mug, the one with the chip in the handle that I'd always intended to throw away but could never bring myself to discard. I sat at my kitchen table in my nightgown, watching the morning light filter through the curtains, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd allowed myself to sit quietly without feeling guilty about productivity or usefulness, or the long list of things I should be doing for other people. The silence felt different this morning, not the empty silence of abandonment I'd grown accustomed to, but the full silence of possibility. Today, I could read a book without interruption. I could take a bath in the middle of the afternoon. I could eat dinner at 5 o'clock or 9 o'clock or not at all if I didn't feel hungry. I could exist for myself alone, without reference to anyone else's needs or expectations or emergencies. But first, I needed to make sure my newfound freedom couldn't be taken away by a single persuasive phone call or guilt-laden visit. At precisely 9 o'clock, when First National Bank opened, I walked through their glass doors wearing my best dress, the navy blue one with small white flowers that I'd bought for Harold's funeral and only worn twice since. The young teller, a woman in her 20s with kind eyes and a professional smile, listened carefully as I explained what I needed. "I'd like to open a new savings account," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "and I want to make sure that no one else can access it. No joint ownership, no beneficiaries with current access, just my name only." She guided me through the paperwork with patience and efficiency, asking only the necessary questions without prying into why a 72-year-old woman might suddenly need financial independence from her family. When we finished, I had a new account containing the $100 I'd managed to preserve from my years of family generosity, plus the $400 from my latest Social Security check. $1,500. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Completely, unquestionably, legally mine. No one could guilt me into sharing it, manipulate me into lending it, or claim any right to it based on past emergencies or family obligations. Walking out of that bank, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The weight of my own power. Not power over others, but power over my own life, my own choices, my own future. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. My next stop was Harold's workshop in the garage. For 3 years, I'd preserved it exactly as he'd left it, tools hanging in precise arrangements on pegboard walls, half-finished projects gathering dust on his workbench, the smell of wood stain and machine oil still lingering in the air. I'd told myself I was honoring his memory, but really, I'd been avoiding the painful reality that he was never coming back to complete those projects, or organize those tools, or fill that space with his quiet, methodical presence. But this morning, as I stood in the doorway looking at thousands of dollars worth of woodworking equipment that no one would ever use again, I saw possibility instead of grief. Harold's tools could become my financial security. His workshop could become my independence fund. His legacy could be my liberation rather than my shrine to the past. I called 3 antique dealers from the phone book, explaining that I had a complete woodworking shop to sell. The first 2 offered to take a look when they had time, their voices suggesting this was a low-priority favor rather than a serious business opportunity. But the third dealer, a man named Robert Chen who specialized in vintage tools, arrived at my house within 2 hours of my call. "This is remarkable," he said, running his hands along Harold's antique hand planes with the reverence of someone who understood their value. "Your husband had exquisite taste in tools. Some of these pieces are from the 1940s, maybe earlier, and they've been maintained beautifully." Harold would have been proud to hear his tools described as remarkable. He'd spent 40 years collecting them, researching their histories, restoring them to perfect working condition. Each piece had a story: where he'd found it, how he'd restored it, what projects he'd used it for. But those stories would die with me if I continued treating his workshop as a museum instead of a resource. The complete collection, including the workbench and the larger machinery, I could offer you $28,000, Robert said after spending an hour cataloging and evaluating. "That's a fair market price, maybe even generous, given how well everything's been preserved." $28,000. More money than I'd seen at one time since Harold's life insurance had paid out, and that had gone directly to funeral expenses and medical bills. This money would be mine alone, earned through my own decision to let go of the past and embrace an uncertain but autonomous future. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation. The transaction took 3 days to complete. Time for Robert to arrange transport for the larger equipment, and for the bank to process the cashier's check he provided. During those 3 days, I cleaned out Harold's workshop with a thoroughness that felt like an exorcism, sorting through boxes of hardware and wood scraps and project plans, keeping only a few small tools as mementos, and donating the rest to the local high school's shop class. By Thursday afternoon, my garage stood empty except for my aging Honda Civic and 30 years' worth of accumulated memories. But my bank account showed a balance that made me gasp: $2,500. For the first time since Harold's death, I had financial breathing room. I could pay my bills without anxiety, buy groceries without calculating every purchase, maybe even afford some small luxuries that would make my daily life more pleasant. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I ordered dinner from Marcello's Italian restaurant and had it delivered to my house. Not the modest, heart-healthy meal Victoria would have ordered for me, but exactly what I wanted: chicken parmesan with extra cheese, garlic bread, and a small tiramisu for dessert. I ate it sitting in Harold's chair, watching the sunset through my living room window, savoring every bite of food I'd chosen for myself without considering anyone else's opinions about my dietary needs or financial limitations. The indulgence cost $37, more than I typically spent on groceries for 3 days. But for the first time in years, I could afford it without guilt or anxiety. The money was mine to spend as I chose, and I chose to spend it on simple pleasure rather than family emergencies. As I was finishing my tiramisu, my neighbor Claire knocked on my front door. Claire lived 2 houses down with her husband Bob, and we'd exchanged pleasantries over the fence for years without developing any real friendship. She was closer to my age, maybe 65, with silver hair and laugh lines that suggested someone who'd learned to find joy in everyday moments. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said when I answered the door, "but I saw the truck here yesterday and today, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay. Moving can be so stressful, especially when you're doing it alone." It took me a moment to realize she thought I was moving out. The antique dealer's truck, the boxes of donated items, the general activity around my house. From the outside, it must have looked like someone preparing to leave. "Oh, I'm not moving," I said, then found myself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. "I'm staying. I'm just making some changes. Something in my tone must have conveyed more than my words, because Claire's expression shifted from polite concern to genuine interest. Changes can be good, she said. Mind if I ask what kind? And suddenly, standing on my front porch in the early evening light, I found myself telling Claire about my afternoon at the bank, about Harold's tools, about the strange liberation of choosing my own dinner without consulting anyone else's preferences. I didn't mention David or Victoria or the years of financial exploitation. Those details felt too raw, too private for a neighbor I barely knew. But I talked about the simple joy of autonomy, of making decisions based on my own wants and needs rather than other people's emergencies. You know, Claire said when I finished, Bob and I have been talking about starting a book club for people in the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just meeting once a month to discuss whatever we're reading. Would you be interested in something like that? A book club. Such a simple thing. But I couldn't remember the last time someone had invited me to participate in something purely social, something designed for enjoyment rather than obligation. Victoria had always dismissed my reading as a waste of time when there's so much real work to be done, and David had never shown any interest in my thoughts about books or ideas or anything that didn't directly relate to his own concerns. I'd love that, I said, surprising myself with how quickly and definitively I responded. I've been reading mysteries lately, but I'm open to anything. Perfect, Claire said, pulling a small notebook from her purse. Can I get your phone number? I'll call you when we set up the first meeting. As I gave her my number, I realized this was the first time in years that someone had asked for my contact information for a positive reason, not to request money or assistance or babysitting, but because they genuinely wanted to include me in something enjoyable. The feeling was so foreign I almost didn't recognize it as happiness. That night, I slept more deeply than I had since Harold died. No phone calls interrupted my rest. No anxiety about family crises kept me awake. No guilt about disappointing people who expected unlimited access to my resources and energy. I slept the sleep of someone who owned her own life completely, and I woke up refreshed rather than exhausted. Over the next 2 weeks, I established new routines that revolved around my own interests and needs rather than other people's emergencies. I started taking afternoon walks through the neighborhood, noticing gardens and architecture I'd never paid attention to during my years of constant worry about family obligations. I visited the public library for the first time in months, checking out novels I'd always wanted to read, but never had time for when I was constantly available for other people's crises. I bought groceries based on what I actually wanted to eat, rather than what was cheapest or most practical. I replaced my worn-out kitchen towels with new ones in colors I liked. I purchased a comfortable reading chair for my living room, something just for me, rather than furniture chosen to accommodate visiting family members who rarely visited and never seemed comfortable when they did. Small changes, but they added up to something revolutionary, a life lived for its own sake rather than in service to others' convenience. The phone calls from David had stopped completely after the first week. Whether he'd given up on accessing my money or was simply planning a different approach, I didn't know, and found I didn't particularly care. For the first time in 15 years, my son's silence felt like relief rather than abandonment. 2 weeks after selling Harold's tools, Claire called about the book club's first meeting. "We're reading The Thursday Murder Club," she said. "It's about retirement home residents who solve cold cases. I thought you might enjoy the mystery angle." "That sounds perfect," I said, already looking forward to discussing a book with people who read for pleasure rather than obligation, who might actually be interested in my thoughts and opinions rather than viewing them as inconvenient interruptions to more important conversations. As I hung up the phone, I caught my reflection in Harold's old mirror hanging in the hallway. The woman looking back at me seemed different somehow. More upright, more alert, more present in her own life. She looked like someone who had places to go and people to see, someone whose time had value, someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered to herself, even if they mattered to no one else. For the first time in years, I looked like someone who was living rather than simply enduring, and that transformation had begun with a single word: no. No to being used. No to being taken for granted. No to accepting treatment I would never dream of giving to another person. And surprisingly, That simple word had opened up space for a much more important word. Yes. Yes to my own needs. Yes to my own interests. Yes to the possibility that 72 wasn't too old to start living for myself. 3 weeks into my new life of autonomy, they showed up without warning. All of them. I was sitting in my new reading chair, enjoying my second cup of morning coffee and the novel Claire had recommended, when the doorbell rang with an urgency that suggested someone leaning on it rather than simply pressing it. Through the window, I could see David's car in my driveway, but also Victoria's silver SUV and a third vehicle I didn't recognize, a black sedan that probably belonged to Victoria's parents. They'd brought reinforcements. This wasn't going to be a family conversation. This was going to be an intervention. I took my time walking to the door, smoothing my hair and checking my appearance in Harold's hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was calm, centered, wearing a soft pink sweater I'd bought for myself the week before. The first new clothing I'd purchased in over 2 years. She looked like someone who belonged in her own home, someone who had every right to control access to her own space and time. When I opened the door, the assembled family stood on my porch like a delegation from a foreign country, their faces bearing identical expressions of determined concern. David stepped forward first, his hands slightly raised in a gesture of appeasement that immediately put me on guard. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone addressing a potentially unstable person. "We've been worried about you. We think something might be wrong. Medically, I mean. Your behavior lately has been so unlike you." Behind him, Victoria clutched a manila folder to her chest like protective armor. Her parents flanked her on either side, their presence clearly intended to lend weight to whatever confrontation they'd planned. Tommy wasn't with them, which somehow made their visit feel more ominous rather than less. "There's nothing wrong with me medically," I said, remaining in my doorway rather than inviting them in. "I'm actually feeling better than I have in years." "Mom, you refused to help with Tommy's dental surgery," David continued, his voice taking on the patient tone people use with confused elderly relatives. "You haven't returned our calls. You've completely withdrawn from the family. That's not normal behavior for you. Not normal." As if my 15 years of financial sacrifice and emotional availability had established my normal as someone who existed solely to solve other people's problems. As if my recent boundary setting was evidence of mental decline, rather than mental clarity. "Perhaps we should sit down and discuss this properly," Victoria's mother interjected, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Helena, isn't it? We haven't been properly introduced, but I'm Victoria's mother, Patricia. We're all concerned about you. Dorothy, not Helena." After 15 years of family gatherings, holidays, and shared celebrations, this woman whose granddaughter-in-law I was still didn't know my name, but she felt qualified to assess my mental state and participate in whatever confrontation they'd orchestrated. "My name is Dorothy," I said quietly, "and I'm not inviting you in. Whatever you need to say, you can say it from there." The correction created a moment of awkward silence. Victoria's face flushed slightly, whether from embarrassment at her mother's mistake or anger at my refusal to accommodate their plans. I couldn't tell. "Dorothy," David said, emphasizing my name with the careful pronunciation of someone trying to demonstrate respect while preparing to override my clearly stated boundaries. "We can't have this conversation on your front porch. The neighbors will hear everything." "Then maybe you should have called first," I said. "Maybe you should have asked if this was a convenient time for me instead of assuming I'd be available whenever you decided you needed to talk." The suggestion that they should have considered my convenience seemed to genuinely puzzle them. David's forehead creased with confusion, as if I'd suggested something fundamentally unreasonable rather than basic courtesy. "Mom, we're your family," he said. "We shouldn't need an appointment to check on you. Check on me." The phrase was carefully chosen, designed to frame their visit as concern rather than confrontation, care rather than control. But their body language told a different story. Victoria's grip on her folder, her parents' positioning like backup singers, David's nervous energy suggesting someone preparing for a difficult negotiation. "You're not checking on me," I said, surprised by how steady my voice remained. "You're here because I stopped giving you money, And you want to understand why so you can fix it. The directness of my statement hit them like cold water. David actually stepped backward, his mouth opening and closing silently. Victoria's face went pale, then red, as if I'd accused her of something shameful rather than simply stating an obvious truth. That's a terrible thing to say, David managed finally. We love you. This has nothing to do with money. Really? I said, reaching into my sweater pocket and pulling out the letter I'd been carrying for weeks. Victoria's letter about managing me, about my inappropriate expectations, about treating my financial contributions as gifts rather than investments in relationships. Then perhaps you can explain this. I held up the letter, and Victoria's face went white. She recognized it immediately, her eyes darting to David with something that looked like panic. Where did you get that? She whispered. I found it in Harold's desk, I said, along with some other interesting documents that suggest my recent behavior isn't as surprising as you'd like me to believe. David reached for the letter, but I pulled it back against my chest. What does it say? He asked, but his voice suggested he already suspected. It says that I'm needy and inappropriate, I said, reading directly from Victoria's careful handwriting. It says that my financial contributions were gifts, not investments in relationships. It says that Tommy barely knows me, and that forcing a relationship between us feels artificial and uncomfortable for everyone involved. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. David's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been shame. Victoria's parents looked uncomfortable, as if they'd walked into a family drama they hadn't expected to witness. Victoria, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. You wrote this? David, you don't understand the context, Victoria said quickly, her voice taking on the rapid, defensive tone of someone caught in a lie. I was frustrated. Your mother was calling every day, wanting to spend time with Tommy, wanting to be included in everything. I felt like she was trying to buy her way into our lives. Buy my way into your lives? I repeated, my voice rising for the first time. I was trying to be part of the family I'd spent 15 years supporting. I was trying to have a relationship with my grandson and my son and his wife. I thought that's what families did. But you don't understand the pressure it put on us, Victoria continued. Her folder now clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. Every time you gave us money, it came with expectations. You wanted more involvement, more inclusion, more time. We felt obligated to include you in things because of your financial contributions. The admission was so breathtakingly honest that it took me a moment to process its full implications. She was confirming everything I'd suspected, that my generosity had been resented rather than appreciated, that my desire for family connection had been seen as manipulation rather than love, that my presence had been tolerated as payment for financial assistance rather than welcomed for its own sake. So you took my money and then complained that I expected to be treated like family in return, I said slowly. That's not... You're twisting everything, Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. Am I? I looked at David, whose face had gone gray with what I hoped was dawning understanding. Son, in the past 15 years, how many times have you called me just to talk? How many times have you visited without needing money or babysitting or some other favor? How many times have you included me in family activities because you wanted me there? Not because you felt obligated? The silence stretched so long that I could hear a dog barking several blocks away, could hear the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn. David stared at his shoes, his hands hanging at his sides like empty tools. I thought we had a good relationship, he said finally, but his voice was uncertain. We had a transactional relationship, I corrected. You needed things, I provided them. You had emergencies, I solved them. You wanted money, I gave it. But when was the last time you asked about my dreams, my fears, my health, my happiness? When was the last time you considered what I might need instead of what you could get from me? We invited you to things, Victoria protested weakly. You assigned me to folding chairs in corners, I said. You ordered my meals without asking what I wanted. You introduced me as a responsibility rather than a joy. You seated me at side tables with my unwrapped gifts because they weren't important enough for your main gift display. Each accusation landed like a physical blow. David's shoulders sagged with what looked like genuine shame, but Victoria's chin lifted defiantly. "We tried to make accommodations for your limitations," she said. "Your hearing isn't what it used to be. Your hands shake sometimes. You can't always keep up with conversations." "My limitations?" I interrupted. "My hearing is fine. My hands only shake when my blood pressure medication needs adjusting. Medication I could afford to adjust if I wasn't spending my medical money on your family emergencies. And I can't keep up with conversations because no one includes me in them." Victoria's parents shifted uncomfortably behind her, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Her father cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should all take a step back," he suggested. "Family disputes can often be resolved through calm discussion and mutual understanding." "This isn't a dispute," I said, looking directly at David. "This is me finally understanding the truth about my place in this family, and choosing not to accept it anymore." "What does that mean?" David asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. I pulled out the bank statements I'd brought with me. 15 years' worth of financial contributions to their family, totaling over $78,000. Money that had come from my grocery budget, my medical care, my home maintenance, my future security. "It means I'm done being your emergency fund," I said. "I'm done being your backup plan. I'm done accepting crumbs of affection in exchange for constant sacrifice. I'm done being the person you only remember when you need something." "But we're your family," David said, and for the first time, his voice cracked with genuine emotion. "No," I said quietly. "You're people who share my DNA and have learned to exploit my love. Family is built on mutual respect, mutual care, mutual consideration. What we have is a business arrangement disguised as family love." I stepped back into my house, my hand on the door. "When you're ready to treat me like a person instead of a resource, when you're ready to value my presence instead of just my presence, when you're ready to love me without expecting me to buy that love with constant sacrifice, then we can talk about being family." "Mom, wait!" David called out, but I was already closing the door. Through the window, I watched them stand on my porch for several minutes, arguing in urgent whispers. Victoria gestured angrily toward my door, her parents looking increasingly uncomfortable, David running his hands through his hair with the helpless movements of someone whose world had suddenly shifted in ways he couldn't control. Finally, they returned to their cars and drove away, leaving me alone in my house with a silence that felt different from any I'd experienced before. Not the silence of abandonment or neglect, but the silence of boundaries successfully defended, of dignity reclaimed, of truth finally spoken. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my reading chair, my hands remarkably steady as I turned back to the page I'd been reading when they arrived. The novel's protagonist was solving a mystery that had puzzled her for decades, finally putting together clues that revealed a truth she'd been avoiding. I understood exactly how she felt. 2 months after the confrontation on my front porch, I stood in the travel agency on Oak Street, holding a glossy brochure for a 2-week Mediterranean cruise that cost more money than I'd spent on myself in the previous 5 years combined. "The October sailing is particularly beautiful," the travel agent, a woman named Sandra with silver hair and bright, encouraging eyes, was saying. "The crowds are smaller, the weather is still warm, and you'll see some of the most stunning sunsets of your life." I stared at the photographs of azure waters and ancient Greek islands, trying to reconcile this possibility with the woman I'd been just months earlier. The woman who'd counted pennies for grocery shopping and denied herself basic comforts to save money for other people's emergencies. The cruise cost $3,200, a number that once would have represented 6 months of careful saving, or a family crisis I'd be expected to solve. Now it represented 2 weeks of freedom I'd never imagined possible. "I'll take it," I said, surprising myself with how quickly the decision came. The balcony cabin with the October 15th departure. Sandra's smile widened with genuine pleasure. "Wonderful. This will be your first cruise?" "My first everything," I said, and realized it was true. At 72 years old, I was about to experience my first vacation that wasn't built around visiting relatives, my first trip planned entirely for my own enjoyment, my first adventure that belonged to nobody but me. As Sandra processed my deposit, I thought about the conversation that had led me here. It had happened 3 weeks earlier, during the monthly book club meeting that had become the highlight of my social calendar. We'd been discussing a novel about a woman who left her comfortable but suffocating marriage to sail around the world alone, and Claire had mentioned that she and Bob were considering a cruise for their 40th anniversary. "I've always wanted to see the Greek islands," I'd said without thinking. "Harold used to talk about visiting there someday, but there was never enough money or time." "So why don't you go?" asked Margaret, another book club member whose directness I'd grown to appreciate. "You're not waiting for anyone's permission, are you?" The question had stayed with me for days. Was I waiting for permission? And if so, whose? David's approval? Victoria's blessing? Some cosmic signal that I deserved to spend money on my own happiness rather than other people's needs? The answer, when it finally came to me, was liberating in its simplicity. I was waiting for my own permission. And sitting in Sandra's office, signing papers for my first solo adventure, I finally gave it to myself. The weeks leading up to my departure transformed into a period of preparation that felt like emerging from hibernation. I bought new clothes, not the practical, conservative pieces I'd worn for years, but colorful blouses and comfortable walking shoes and a flowing dress in sunset colors that made me feel beautiful when I tried it on. I purchased a new suitcase, lightweight and wheeled, designed for someone who planned to travel rather than someone who expected to stay home and wait for other people's emergencies. I made arrangements for Mrs. Patterson to check on my house and collect my mail, a simple transaction that would have required weeks of family coordination in my previous life. No guilt, no elaborate explanations, no justification for why I deserved to leave town for personal pleasure. Just two neighbors helping each other with the practical details of living independent lives. The night before my departure, I sat in Harold's chair, though I'd begun thinking of it as simply my chair, and wrote letters to David and Victoria. Not angry letters or accusatory ones, but clear, honest explanations of the woman I was becoming and the boundaries I intended to maintain going forward. To David, I wrote, "I'm going to Greece for 2 weeks. I wanted you to know where I was, not because I need permission, but because despite everything that's happened, you're still my son, and I still love you. But I love myself now too, enough to insist on being treated with the same respect I give to others. When you're ready to build a relationship based on mutual care rather than financial convenience, I'll be here. Until then, I'm living my life for me." To Victoria, I wrote something simpler. "I forgive you for seeing me as an inconvenience rather than an opportunity. I hope someday you understand the difference." I sealed both letters and left them on my kitchen counter with instructions for Mrs. Patterson to mail them the day after my departure. Not because I was avoiding confrontation, but because I was choosing when and how to engage, rather than remaining constantly available for other people's emotional emergencies. The morning of my departure, I woke up feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades. Pure excitement. Not the anxious anticipation of managing other people's expectations, but the joyful eagerness of someone about to embark on an adventure designed entirely for her own pleasure. I dressed carefully in my new traveling clothes, comfortable pants in navy blue, a soft coral blouse that brought color to my face, the lightweight jacket I'd bought specifically for airplane travel. Looking in Harold's mirror, I saw a woman who appeared ready for adventure rather than resignation, someone who belonged in the world rather than hiding from it. The taxi arrived precisely on time, driven by a cheerful man in his 50s, who helped me load my new suitcase and asked about my destination, with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. "Greece," he said when I told him. "My wife and I went there for our 25th anniversary. Most beautiful place on earth. You picked a good time of year, too. Fewer crowds, perfect weather." As we drove toward the airport, I watched my neighborhood pass by the window, the houses where I'd lived quietly for so many years, the streets I'd walked during my loneliest periods, the familiar landmarks of a life that had felt increasingly small and constrained. But today, instead of feeling trapped by familiarity, I felt grateful for the foundation that had allowed me to finally choose something bigger. Check-in at the airport went smoothly. Another small miracle of independence. No one to coordinate with, no complicated family schedules to accommodate, no guilt about leaving anyone behind. Just me and my passport and my boarding pass, moving through the process with the calm efficiency of someone who owned her own time completely. On the plane, I found myself seated next to a woman roughly my age who was also traveling alone. Ellen was a retired teacher from Portland, taking her first solo vacation after her husband's death the previous year. "I was terrified to book this trip," she confided as we settled in for the flight. "My children thought I was crazy, traveling alone at my age. But I figured if I didn't do it now, I never would." We spent the flight sharing stories about our previous lives, her 40 years of teaching, my decades of family sacrifice, and our current journeys toward independence. Ellen had sold her large family home and moved into a downtown condo where she could walk to theaters and museums. I told her about my book club, my new financial independence, my decision to stop being available for other people's crises. "It's amazing how much life you can live when you stop living it for other people," Ellen said as our plane began its descent into Athens. The first week of my cruise exceeded every expectation I dared to have. I woke up each morning in my small but comfortable cabin, opened the balcony door to Mediterranean sunshine, and planned my day based entirely on my own interests and energy level. No phone calls about family emergencies, no guilt about being unavailable, no need to justify my choices to anyone but myself. I explored ancient ruins in Santorini, wandering through narrow streets with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere else to be. I ate fresh seafood in waterfront tavernas, ordering exactly what I wanted without considering anyone else's dietary preferences or budget constraints. I watched sunsets from my balcony with a glass of wine, reading novels I'd brought specifically for pleasure rather than obligation. But the most transformative moment came during our stop in Mykonos, when I found myself sitting alone at a cafe overlooking the harbor, writing in the journal I'd started keeping during the trip. A young couple at the next table was arguing about money. She wanted to buy a piece of local pottery. He was worried about the expense, their voices carrying the familiar tension of people trying to balance desires with practical limitations. Watching them, I realized I felt compassion rather than recognition. Their struggle was real and valid, but it was no longer mine. I had spent so many years denying my own wants, sacrificing my own dreams, accepting limitations imposed by other people's needs, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply want something and be able to have it. That afternoon, I bought the pottery the young woman had been admiring, a beautiful blue vase with traditional Greek patterns, and had it shipped to my home, not because I needed it, but because I loved it. Not because it was practical, but because it was beautiful. Not because someone else would appreciate it, but because it would remind me of this moment when I chose joy over obligation. The second week of the cruise brought even deeper revelations. I joined a group of solo travelers for shore excursions, discovering that I was actually quite good at making friends when I wasn't constantly worried about managing other people's expectations. I took a cooking class in Crete, learning to make spanakopita from a local chef who praised my natural instincts and suggested I had been denying my talents for too long. Most surprisingly, I found myself flirting with a fellow passenger, a widowed gentleman named Frank from Chicago who shared my love of mystery novels and had kind eyes that crinkled when he laughed. Nothing serious, nothing that required commitment or complicated emotions, just the simple pleasure of being appreciated by someone who found me interesting rather than useful. "You have such a calm energy," Frank said during one of our evening conversations on the ship's deck. "Like someone who's made peace with herself." I realized he was right. Somewhere between setting boundaries with my family and booking this cruise, between joining the book club and selling Harold's tools, I had made peace with myself. Not because my life was perfect, but because it was finally mine. On the last night of the cruise, I stood on my balcony watching the lights of the ship reflect on the dark Mediterranean waters, and I understood something profound about the nature of transformation. I hadn't become a different person over these past months. I had become more myself, the woman I might have been all along if I'd never learned to confuse self-sacrifice with love, usefulness with worth, accommodation with kindness. The woman standing on that balcony had dreams and opinions and preferences that mattered. She had friends who valued her company, money she'd earned through her own choices, plans for a future that belonged entirely to her. She was 72 years old, and she was just beginning to live. When I returned home 10 days later, tanned and relaxed and full of stories about ancient temples and seaside villages, I found 17 voicemail messages from David and Victoria. I listened to them all, noting the progression from anger to confusion to what might have been genuine concern, but I didn't return their calls immediately. Instead, I unpacked my beautiful new pottery, arranged it on my mantel where it caught the afternoon light perfectly, and called Claire to tell her about my adventures. Real friends, I had learned, were people who celebrated your happiness rather than those who only contacted you during crises. David's calls could wait. Victoria's drama could wait. Their emergencies and needs and expectations could all wait, because for the first time in my adult life, I had learned the revolutionary truth that my own happiness was not selfish. It was necessary, and I was just getting started. 6 months later, I sat in my garden on a warm spring morning, reading the letter that had arrived in yesterday's mail. The handwriting was Tommy's. Careful, deliberate, the penmanship of someone who'd taken time to craft each word thoughtfully. "Dear Grandma Dorothy," it began, and even that simple salutation made me smile. Not because of the formal distance it maintained, but because it was honest. We were not close enough for casual endearments, and his acknowledgement of that reality felt more respectful than false intimacy. I'm writing this for a school project about family history, but also because I wanted to tell you some things I've been thinking about. Mom and Dad don't know I'm writing to you. I found your address on an old envelope in Dad's desk. I set the letter down for a moment and looked around the garden I'd been redesigning since my return from Greece. The blue pottery from Mykonos sat among the new plantings, lavender and rosemary that filled the air with Mediterranean scents, colorful perennials that would bloom throughout the summer. This space had become my sanctuary, a place where I could sit each morning with coffee and watch the world wake up, without waiting for anyone else's needs to dictate my day. Tommy's letter continued. "I've been thinking about money lately, especially after overhearing some conversations between my parents. I never realized before how much you helped our family financially over the years. Dad was telling Mom that they need to figure out how to pay for my college without your help. And Mom said something about how they'd gotten too dependent on your generosity. The admission didn't surprise me, but it did feel like a small validation. They were finally acknowledging, at least to each other, what I'd known for years, that their lifestyle had been subsidized by my sacrifices in ways they'd taken for granted. I also found some old photos in the attic," Tommy wrote. "Pictures of you and Dad when he was my age, and some of you and Grandpa Harold. You looked really happy in those pictures. Different from how you looked at family dinners. In the old photos, you looked like you belonged. At our dinners, you looked like you were visiting." The observation was so perceptive it took my breath away. This 15-year-old had seen something that the adults in his life had managed to ignore for years. The difference between belonging and being tolerated, between inclusion and accommodation. I picked up my coffee mug, a new one I'd bought myself in shades of blue and green that reminded me of the Aegean Sea, and continued reading. "I want you to know that I remember more than my parents think I do. I remember you teaching me to plant seeds in your garden when I was little. I remember you reading me stories about knights and dragons. I remember you making me hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows when I scraped my knee riding my bike. I remember feeling safe with you in a way that felt different from safe with other people." Tears blurred my vision as I read those words. Tommy had been 7 when those memories were made, before Victoria had decided that forcing a relationship between us was artificial and uncomfortable, before my presence had been relegated to folding chairs and side tables, before my love had been redefined as manipulation and my generosity reframed as expectation. "I'm sorry we stopped visiting you regularly. I'm sorry about my birthday party where you looked so sad when you left early. I'm sorry about Dad's birthday dinner at the restaurant. I saw them put you at that weird chair by yourself, and even at 15 I knew it was wrong. But I didn't know how to say anything without making it worse." The fact that Tommy had noticed, had felt uncomfortable with my treatment but hadn't known how to address it, somehow made me feel less invisible than I'd felt in years. Someone had seen, someone had recognized the injustice, even if they'd lacked the power or knowledge to intervene. "I don't know if you'll write me back, and I understand if you don't want to, but I wanted you to know that I see you differently now. not as someone who owes us things or someone we have to manage, but as a person who deserves better than how we treated you. And I wanted you to know that if you ever want to try again, just you and me, not the whole family with all their weird rules and expectations, I'd like that. He'd included his email address and cell phone number, adding, "These are mine, not my parents. If you want to talk sometime, it would just be between us." I folded the letter carefully and sat back in my garden chair, watching a butterfly land on the lavender bush I'd planted where Harold's workshop used to be. The irony wasn't lost on me. The space that had once represented the past I couldn't let go of had become a garden representing the future I was still creating. The past 6 months had been a revelation in what life could feel like when it belonged entirely to me. I'd joined a community theater group and discovered I had a talent for costume design. I'd started volunteering at the literacy center, helping adults learn to read with the patience and encouragement I'd once reserved for my family's crises. I'd developed friendships with women my age who valued my conversation, my humor, my perspectives on everything from books to politics to the best places to find bargains on quality clothing. Frank from the cruise had visited twice, and we'd developed a correspondence that might eventually become something more serious. Or it might remain a comfortable friendship between two people who'd learned to appreciate companionship without desperation. Either way, it felt like a gift rather than an obligation. Most importantly, I'd learned to live with the silence from David and Victoria without interpreting it as abandonment. Their absence from my life had created space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial utility. I no longer woke up each morning wondering if today would bring an emergency that required my immediate response and financial resources. My bank account had grown steadily over the months. Not because I was earning more money, but because I was no longer hemorrhaging it to other people's crises. I'd been able to repair my roof, replace my aging water heater, and even start a small emergency fund for my own future needs. The security felt revolutionary after years of living paycheck to paycheck, because every spare dollar had gone to someone else's definition of necessity. But Tommy's letter reminded me that healing didn't always follow neat timelines or absolute boundaries. This 15-year-old boy hadn't chosen the family dynamics that had marginalized me. He'd been shaped by them, just as I had been, and his emerging ability to see them clearly suggested possibility rather than repetition. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table with paper and pen, something I'd learned to appreciate again during my months of independence. There was something grounding about handwritten correspondence, about taking time to choose words carefully, rather than responding immediately to every demand for my attention. "Dear Tommy," I wrote, "thank you for your thoughtful letter and for sharing memories I'd begun to think only I had preserved. Yes, we were close when you were younger. And yes, something changed in our family that made that closeness feel unwelcome to others. But that doesn't mean it was wrong or artificial. It means it was real enough to threaten people who weren't comfortable with genuine relationships." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. This letter might be the beginning of rebuilding something valuable, or it might be a final gesture of honesty before continuing on separate paths. Either outcome was acceptable, as long as it was built on truth rather than obligation. "I would like to have coffee with you sometime, just the two of us, with no agenda except getting to know each other as the people we are now, rather than the roles we were assigned in our family. But I want you to understand something important. My love is no longer for sale. I won't resume being your family's emergency fund or problem solver. I won't return to folding chairs and side tables and tolerating disrespect in exchange for access to family events. If we rebuild a relationship, it will be because we value each other, not because anyone needs anything from me." I sealed the letter and walked to the mailbox, noting how different this felt from my years of anxious correspondence about family crises and financial emergencies. This letter represented possibility rather than obligation, hope rather than desperation. That evening, Claire called to invite me to dinner with her and Bob, and another couple they thought I'd enjoy meeting. 6 months ago, such invitations had been rare enough to feel precious. Now they were regular enough to feel normal, evidence of a social life built on genuine connection rather than family duty. "Actually," I said, surprising myself, "why don't you all come here instead? I'll cook something Greek. I learned some wonderful recipes on my cruise. The offer felt natural, generous without being self-sacrificing. I wanted to share my home and my new culinary skills with people who appreciated both without taking either for granted. As I planned the menu for my dinner party, I found myself thinking about the folding chair that had started this entire transformation. It sat now in my basement, relegated to emergency seating for occasions when I had more guests than regular chairs could accommodate. But it no longer symbolized my place in the world. It was simply a piece of furniture, useful when needed, stored when not. The difference, I realized, was that I now determined when it was needed, rather than allowing others to assign me to it permanently. Later that night, I sat in Harold's chair, though I'd stopped thinking of it as his and started thinking of it as ours. A shared space where I could remember our life together while living my new life fully, and reflected on the journey that had brought me from invisible family member to autonomous woman. The path hadn't been straight or simple. There had been moments of doubt, periods of loneliness, the constant challenge of learning to value my own needs after decades of denying them. But every difficult step had led me closer to this moment. Sitting in my own home, surrounded by objects I'd chosen for my own pleasure, planning dinner for friends who valued my company, corresponding with a grandson who might learn to see me as a person rather than a resource. I thought about the woman who had sat in that corner chair at Marcello's restaurant 8 months ago, accepting humiliation as the price of family inclusion. She had been me, but she felt like someone I'd known long ago, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer needed to be. The transformation hadn't been about becoming someone new. It had been about becoming someone true. The woman I'd always been underneath the layers of accommodation and self-sacrifice and desperate desire to be needed. That woman had opinions worth hearing, stories worth telling, love worth receiving rather than just giving. As I prepared for bed, I made a mental note to call the travel agent tomorrow. Frank had mentioned wanting to see Scotland, and I'd always been curious about the Highlands. Maybe it was time for another adventure, another opportunity to discover what else was possible when you stopped limiting yourself to other people's definitions of who you were supposed to be. The house settled around me with the comfortable sounds of a home that belonged to someone who valued it. Outside my bedroom window, the garden rustled in the evening breeze, filled with plants that would bloom because I'd chosen them, not because they served anyone else's needs or preferences. For the first time in my adult life, I fell asleep planning tomorrow's possibilities rather than dreading tomorrow's obligations. And that, I thought as sleep claimed me, was worth more than all the folding chairs and family dinners and desperate attempts to buy love that I'd left behind. The woman who had once accepted crumbs was now feasting on her own choices, and she was finally, completely, beautifully full. Have you ever found yourself accepting less than you deserve from people who should cherish you most? Have you ever been the person sitting in the corner chair while others enjoy the main table? Leave your story in the comments below. And if this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that help someone else realize they're not alone, and that it's never too late to choose yourself.